In this video, we'll be learning how to simplify fractions. So simplifying fractions is a pretty easy concept, but the one trick is that you need to be comfortable with your multiplication and your division facts, okay? So that's why we've been practicing our facts so much, is because we always say we're going to use our multiplication and division facts for so many other things in math, and simplifying is just one of those. So if you hear the term simplifying fractions, you may hear it in a few different ways. I'm actually going to write one more word, simplest form. All right, so I've already used the term simplify. You might also hear this as reducing fractions, finding fractions in the lowest terms, or representing fractions in the lowest terms, or representing a fraction in simplest form. So either of these four terms mean the same exact thing. We typically like to use the word simplify or simplest form. I typically won't use the word reducing fractions, but when you see exactly how we're doing this, that's what we're doing. We're going to take a fraction that has bigger numbers and make it equivalent to a fraction that has smaller numbers. So the first fraction we're going to work with is one that we're all familiar with, and we could probably come up with some equivalent fractions pretty easily to, is 2/4. So the process for simplifying is pretty simple. Instead of thinking multiples like you think when you're adding or subtracting fractions, I want you to think factors, which is why we've been practicing factors and multiples so much, because we need to use it now for fractions. So when you're simplifying fractions, you're going to find the greatest common factor of your numerator and your denominator. So I'm going to find my greatest common factor of 2 and of 4. So I'm going to use my factor rainbow strategy, and I'm going to put 2 and 4 down here. So I need to think, what can I multiply by 2 to get the product of 2? Well, I know that 1 times 2 equals 2. Pretty simple, right? There are no other factors that I can use to multiply to give me a product of 2. So that's pretty much done. All right, now let's focus on 4. Again, if we're focusing on our factor rainbow strategy, we want to start with 1. 1 times 4. And we know that 2 times 2 equals 4. All right, so in order to represent this fraction in simplest form, we need to find the greatest common factor of 2 and 4, of both our numerator and denominator. And if you look here, the greatest number, the greatest factor that they both share is 2. So that means that my GCF, my greatest common factor, equals 2. Okay, so that 2 is going to be our magic number that we're going to use to help us simplify. All right, so if I'm looking at 2/4 again, I've got my greatest common factor of 2. I'm going to divide now by my greatest common factor. Okay, so my first step was to find my factors of 2 and 4, which were my numerator and denominator. My next step was to find my greatest common factor, and my last step is to divide by that greatest common factor, okay? All right, and that's what I have right here. So I'm taking my numerator and I'm dividing it by 2, which was my greatest common factor, and my denominator, which is 4, and dividing it again by my greatest common factor of 2. Well, this is where our division facts need to come into play. If we're not comfortable with our division facts, we can always work backwards and use our multiplication facts. So that's what I'm going to do just to model this. So but think about this. What factor can I multiply by 2 to get the product of 2? Okay, 2 divided by 2 equals what? What number times 2 will equal 2? Well, I know 1 times 2 equals 2. So 2 divided by 2 must equal 1. All right, now let's work with our denominator. 4 divided by 2 must be 2 because 2 times 2 equals 4. So that means 2/4 in simplest form, in simplest terms, is 1/2. And we all know that 2/4 is equivalent to 1/2. 1/2 is just presented in simplest form. Now, what does this mean exactly? Simplest form just means that there are no other factors other than 1 that can be divided by the numerator or the denominator. Okay? The other way to think of this is it's just a simpler way to represent this fraction. They're equivalent. They mean the same thing. They show the same value, but 1/2 is just presented in a simpler way. Okay? It's easier to give somebody 1/2 of your pie than it is to give them 2/4 of your pie if you're cutting it into 4 equal pieces. This case, you're cutting it just into 2 equal pieces. Okay? Think of the word simple when you think of the word simplify or the term simplest form. Let's do another one. The next problem that I have, next fraction that I have here is 6/8, and we're going to write this in simplest form. So again, I'm going to find my greatest common factor of my numerator and denominator, which is 6 and 8. Okay, so if I'm doing my factor rainbow, so I'm setting it up like this, I know that 1 times 6 is 6. I know that 2 times 3 is 6, and I've just listed all of my factors. Now for 8, I know that 1 times 8 is 8, 2 times 4 is 8, and these are all of my factors. Now, what is my greatest common factor? Well, if I'm looking here, again, looks like my greatest common factor is 2. This is just a coincidence because it's not always going to be 2. We can't just assume that 2 is our greatest common factor of our numerator and denominator, especially if it's an odd number, okay? But in this case, since it is, I'm going to divide 6/8 by my greatest common factor, which is 2. So looking back, I've listed my factors of my numerator and denominator. I found my greatest common factor, which is 2. And now I need to divide by that greatest common factor. So let's work backwards. What can I multiply by 2 to get the product of 6? Well, I know that 3 times 2 is 6. So that means that 6 divided by 2 equals 3. What about 8 divided by 2? I know that 4 times 2 equals 8. So that must mean 6/8 in simplest form is 3/4. All right, I'm going to give you one more example, but this time we are going to divide by a different number. Okay, the next one is 4/12. So if you are comfortable at this point, you can pause the video and go ahead and simplify 4/12 for me. We are going to find our greatest common factor of 4 and 12. I'm going to move a little bit faster this time. You can do this with me, pause at any time. Factors of 4, 1 times 4, 2 times 2. Factors of 12, 1 times 12, 2 times 3, 2 times 6, oh my goodness, 3 times 4. Need a little bit of a mistake here. This is 6. All right, so this time, if you're really looking closely, my greatest common factor is not 2. Now, if I make a mistake and I decide, oh, 2 looks like my greatest common factor, I can certainly divide by 2. I'm going to get an equivalent fraction. It's not going to be in simplest form, okay? But let's look here. Looks like 4 is my greatest common factor. So I'm going to take 4/12 and divide by 4, which is my greatest common factor. I know 4 divided by 4 is 1. And 12 divided by 4 is 3. And this is because, I'm working backwards, 1 times 4 is 4. 3 times 4 equals 12. So 4/12 in simplest form is 1/3. All right, I'm going to post one more question for you to try completely on your own at the end of this video. Make sure that you follow the steps, you show your work. This is not something that we can do in our head, so please make sure you show your work for your factoring and for the division here. And if you need to rewind the video at any point to look at the steps, to look at the process, you may do so.